Welcome everybody online. We have made it. Steve is going to run into your show. This is the Josh and Steve show.
Right.
Or Steve and Josh show. Which one is it?
Tonight's Josh and Steve.
Oh, it's tonight's Josh and Steve. It depends on who's teaching, apparently. But if you're online with us, welcome. Sorry for the couple-minute delay. Thank you for everybody being patient with us. We were having I'll just say a church gathering. What would you call it?
That's good.
Yeah, a church gathering where we were just talking about going forward. If hopefully if you're joining us online here, you're able to watch it via Zoom. If you were not able to watch it via Zoom, or you did not know we were having it via Zoom, we don't have your email address. So if you would like for us to be able to communicate with you, please call the church or go on the contact form and give us your email address. That's the best way that we can communicate during these times, especially as stamp prices are what, like 50
cents now?
They're more than that, aren't they?
I think it's 50.
50, 51? See?
Why can't they ever do that at even numbers?
No, see, it's the federal government, man. Okay. So, all right, we won't go there. So, we're actually going to be finishing up tonight our series on the patriarchs. These are in 6-week segments. Our next one is going to be called, do we call it the Deliverers? Is that what we're going for? The Deliverers. So hopefully we've had a very serious graphic for you guys up here behind us. Next week's...
next week.
Not next week, but when it comes.
There is no Wednesday night activities next week.
That's right. It's spring break week.
We're giving you all a week off break. Enjoy. And
so
me and Josh will be back here smiling on the... whatever date that is, 24th.
Yep. So 2 weeks then, right? Will it be here 2 weeks from now?
Yes.
We're going to have a really cool new slide. I know I'm building it up for no reason, but we have tried to make it funny and fun this time. Yep. So we're going to be talking to the Deliverers, and that kind of is going to be in the vein of the Judges, and not the Judges,
the captivity, conquest, or
the Exodus?
The Exodus, conquest, and Judges area.
Yeah. So that kind of gives you a heads up where we're going. So tonight we're finishing the patriarchs, and I hope that this is going to kind of dive into where we're going, but I want to give you some highlights and some recaps about where we've been with the patriarchs, because in Genesis, where we've been the whole time, there's a lot of overarching themes that I think when we get to go through a book at the speed that we've gone through. Think about this. Genesis was 50 chapters?
50, yeah.
50 chapters. We have done 50 chapters, not every last little bit, but 50 chapters in 6 weeks. That's pretty fast, right? So it gives you a speed that we've gone through. And one of my favorite things when we're going through the Bible at that kind of pace, sometimes it's really awesome to slow down and dig into the intricate details. And sometimes I think it's really beneficial to go really fast because you get this God-sized view of what he's trying to do. Because we're not moving so slow. You have an idea of the entire God story of the book of Genesis in 6 weeks. So what are some of those things? One of the things I want to point out to us is that Genesis has taught us, I'm falling into that word.
Genesis.
Thing where you say a word enough times you can't say it anymore. That Genesis teaches us is that God has a plan and that he invites us to be a part of that plan. And yet no matter how hard we try and mess it up, no matter how much sin has broken, no matter how we try to push our own will on to God, that God has a plan that's going to persevere. And I think that is just an incredible highlight that we should have from our whole study, and something that we can know is God being the same yesterday, today, and forever, that God has a plan right now, that no matter how much brokenness and no matter how much we try and force our own will onto God, that God's plan is going to persevere. And I think that's a really neat thing. It's something we are able to rest in and find peace in, that God has a plan that we might mess up our part, but we can't mess up God's part. And I think that's a comforting thing. Another thing is that we see God showing grace in the wake of sin. When sin happens, when we see sin and sin's brokenness affects us or affects those around us, or we are affected by someone else's sin, we see God give grace. And I think that is really just an incredible thing to remember. We saw that in Abraham's life. We saw it in Isaac's life. We saw it in Jacob's life, that even when sin happened, God provided grace and had restoration and allowed them to continue and be a part of his plan. And I think that's an incredible highlight for God for us. And then also, on the opposite side, that God is not okay with sin, that God exercises his wrath towards sin, his hatred of sin. And we can see that. I know we didn't necessarily cover all these parts, but in Genesis, think of Sodom and Gomorrah. Think of Noah and the flood. Think of, oh no, my mind's breaking. You want to give me an example? Lot's wife. You know, when you look at and you see this, that God is not okay with sin. For us as believers, sometimes God gives grace, but for the sake of God's holiness, we see that he's not okay with sin. He's not going to leave sin unchecked. And that's something that we should live in. The idea of reverent fear, I think, is the way to describe the fear of God. It's this reverence for we should take God serious, but at the same time, when people sin against us and it's causing us harm, that God's not going to leave it unchecked. And I think that's something that for us to have peace and rest in. And then the last thing for God is we see that he shows favor to those who, not favoritism, but he shows favor to those who seek righteousness. And we're going to really see that in Joseph's story today, that when we stop and we slow down and we do it God's way and we wait on God to move, that we see the blessings that come with seeking and living a life filled with righteousness. So that's a little bit about the highlights we've seen for God, but also for us as people. There's some highlights that I think that Genesis has taught us. And it's the way that we deal with sin affects those around us. Particularly in these cases in Genesis, our children. You know, and it shows us, it should give us some reverence and some pause for that fact, but also just kind of in general that, you know, we can't just go through life like sinning, because it's kind of like a bowling ball. It's just going to hit everything and knock everything out of place and cause damage and harm in its path. And so I think that that's something for us to remember. We also, though, that the way we model and talk about our relationship with God gives credit or discredit to those around us. And I think that that is an incredible one as we seek to be a life filled with righteousness. One of the things we're going to be doing is discipling. And that the way we live and act truly makes a difference. And I think that that is something that should, again, it's like the double-edged sword, give us pause, but also encourage us that what you do, the faithfulness that you have every single day in seeking and following God actually makes a difference in people's lives around you. That does not go unnoticed. And then lastly, when we try and force our plans onto God, it will backfire and cause us heartache. Yep. So, and I think that is just one that for every facet of life, right? We know that God has a plan and he has something that he's called us to, but when we try and force our plans onto God, that it will backfire on us. And we're going to see that in the Joseph's life story today, that he waited on God, and we're going to see how the blessing was the biggest and the best yet. So I know that was a really big kind of intro, I know, but I just felt like it was kind of nice to wrap up where we've been over the last 6 weeks, because Joseph's life is kind of in my mind, the countercultural, kind of the opposite that we see with, I don't want to say Abraham, because Abraham was,
what's that word you use?
Credited righteousness.
Contrapositive.
The contrapositive, you know, that Abraham's life is, you know, is filled right, but we definitely in Isaac's and in Jacob's life, we see that Joseph really goes about it doing God's way. And so we see kind of when we try and force our way, when we don't always seek righteousness, what happens. And then with Joseph, we see someone who is way more consistent in seeking righteousness. My daughter's cheering for me over there with her rattle. So, and so I think that's just a really neat thing to wrap up. So without further ado, we're going to jump into Joseph's story. And Steve, we're going to be in Genesis 37, and we're going to read 5 through 11. And the background of this, it's not much except that Jacob has now been named Israel, and he has a bunch of sons. And now we're going to see the relationship of his sons, and this little thing called favoritism is going to rear its ugly head again for us. So Genesis 37, 5 through 11.
All right. So now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more, meaning they hated him already. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Did you say to 11?
Yes.
Then he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind.
So just before this, we are introduced to Joseph, and it says that he had a coat of many colors. Steve, what kind of value would a coat of many colors had?
A lot?
Yeah, a lot. That's all I wanted you to say. It was right. Yeah. And we find out that in the passage right before that Joseph is known as his father's favorite child. And then God speaks to Joseph through dreams, and dreams are very important in Joseph's life, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But he speaks this dream, and kind of what's the summary of these dreams?
Oh, the initial summary is Joseph's kind of a jerk, sharing these dreams with his family. But the first one is that his brothers will bow down to him, and then the second one is not only will his brothers bow down to him, that his mother and father, which is kind of an interesting thing because there's four moms involved in all this, but I guess it's the mother figure that would bow down to him. And actually, his mother was no longer living at this point, I believe.
So all that to be said, you see how there's already favoritism, and then in comes one of the younger children, and they say, "Hey, by the way, everybody's going to serve me." There's a recipe for some disaster, right? Some family conflict. And so, sorry about that.
I thought that was an illustration.
No, I should have sneezed this way. So, sorry, Steve. All right, sorry. It's a recipe for conflict, right?
Yes.
So what happens next is Joseph is at home. His brothers have taken the flocks out to pasture them, and his family sends Joseph to check on his brothers. And his brothers see him coming, and they saw, "Here comes that dreamer," is what they say. "Here comes that dreamer," in a very snarly tone. And they say, "You know what we should do? We should kill him." And then so one of the other brothers, Reuben, if I'm remembering correctly, says, "Hey, we shouldn't kill him. He's our brother. Let's throw him here in this pit." His plan was to come back and save Joseph. But while he is gone, what happens is his brothers see some Ishmaelite traders coming along. They sell him as a slave to these Ishmaelite traders, and he ends up in Egypt as a slave in the house of Potiphar. And so that's where we're going to pick up the story in Genesis 39, 1 through 6. So if you're following along, Genesis 39, 1 through 6. It says, "Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him from down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From that time, from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate." And so we see this difference, right, about Joseph's life. Clearly, he maybe wasn't the wisest person at the beginning. He had obviously seen the favoritism, did a little sibling rivalry, kind of bragged about the dream, he basically bragged about this foreseeing of the Lord, saying, "Hey, here's the plan that I'm going to have for you." And then yet, we see him have this really negative and terrible event in his life where he is threatened to be killed by his brothers, and then sold into slavery, ending up in a foreign country of people that would have not been, I would say, kind to him, or he would have had fond and warm feelings for. And what does he do? It doesn't say that he does the minimal. It doesn't say he begrudges it. Clearly, we see that he is as faithful to the Lord and does his best in everything that he does. And that the reason I say that is because when we look in verse 3, it says, "His master saw that the Lord was with him." Clearly, Joseph's actions and his words had to be in such a way that it pointed to the Lord. Because when the Lord is capitalized, it's definitely not in the Lord as in the title, but the Lord as in God. I say when L-O-R-D is all in capital letters. And so clearly it's saying that the Lord was the one who was getting the credit for Joseph's success. And so what we see about him is that he clearly is faithful, and he's seeking a life that is righteous. And in the moment, I'll say in the face of bad circumstances, Joseph has chosen to be faithful and righteous and seek righteousness and follow God. So much so that the people around him have taken notice. So much so that the people around him are being affected by it, right? God is showing favor and grace to a captain of the guard, an Egyptian, because of Joseph's faithfulness. But, Steve, is this how the story ends? No. Does it go well in the next part? No, it doesn't, right? So I'm trying to throw Steve softball questions tonight. So it doesn't go, but this is where when I was trying to get at when we gave this long intro, we're going to see that when we are patient and when we wait on it and do it in the Lord's way, that sometimes it doesn't always go easy, but the payoff is always the best in the end, because what's going to happen next is Joseph's, Potiphar, who is Joseph's owner's wife, is going to come after him and try to tempt him sexually and ask Joseph to sleep with her. And he's going to repeatedly deny this. And eventually one day, Joseph is in a position where he's alone with her, and she comes at him again, and she grabs a hold of his clothes, and in order to run away, he ends up leaving his garment. And we're going to be in chapter 39, verse 19 through 23, and Steve, read us what happens here.
As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison.
So we'll start right there. So what happened is he left the garment, and she created a story that said Joseph had tried to come sleep with me. How dare you bring this Hebrew into our house to make fun of us, where he would even think to do this act. And so that's where we see Potiphar reacting, and Joseph has been blessed by God, right? Potiphar's been blessed by God because of Joseph's faithfulness, and yet we don't see that Joseph, he comes in and says, did this really happen? None of this. There's no fair trial here. He just immediately gets thrown into prison, the prison where Pharaoh's prisoners were kept. And so verse 21, what happens next, Steve?
But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed.
So I want you to take pause. I want us to all take pause for this second and ask ourselves, would we be able to have done what Joseph did here in this situation? Who would be ready to throw in the towel right now and say, hey, I have sought God, and yet I've been sown into slavery, or sold into slavery, and yet I did everything right, and now what's happened to me is gone from bad to worse. All I have done is follow God faithfully, and my life has taken me from being a slave to now being in prison. Because I'm going to tell you, I don't think that being in prison in these times, or at least I think I can say I know that being in prison in these times was not a pleasant experience. I don't think it's ever a pleasant experience, but typically when you got thrown into prison, it was a death sentence. There was going to be some kind of disease or something. It was going to be in such a state where your life was going to get as miserable as it could and eventually die. A slow kind of rotting death. And that's where Joseph was. And when I sit there, and the reason I want to take pause is because I think that's what I need, is when we read the story, because we know the ending, we don't take for account just how hard and how incredibly faithful to his love for God Joseph had to have been to say, what's the next thing that he does? Is continue to be faithful to God in the best of his abilities, in the circumstances he's in, so much so that yet again the people around him see what? What do they see, Steve? What was Joseph's life telling them?
Oh, that everything he did was successful, or
right.
was blessed, or yeah.
Yeah, so we see that all that he did, that people around him are going, look, I can clearly see that God's hand is on this person. That Steve said, that everything he did was blessed by God. I just want us to say, I don't know, to recognize the difficulty and how hard that would have been for Joseph in this moment. But Steve, read Genesis 41 through 4 for us.
41 through 4? Okay.
Yes.
Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed. The cup, keep going?
No.
Oh, sorry.
I'll summarize the
Sorry.
dreams for the
Gotcha.
sake of time for us. But so Joseph is right. He's in custody. Pharaoh's, and these were not, when we hear the chief baker and chief cupbearer, I think we think of these kind of as menial people, that don't really matter. No, if you were the chief cupbearer to Pharaoh, you would have been someone that was very trusted, right? Because you're the person who has to be trusted so wholeheartedly that you were the last person to taste before Pharaoh did. Meaning that if there was anybody that was going to protect Pharaoh's life from poisoning, it was this person. And if there's anybody who for sure could have killed Pharaoh with poisoning, it was this person.
And also more than likely, that person's going to stand right next to Pharaoh during meals and all that kind of stuff. And whatever is said, he gets to hear. And Pharaoh's probably like, "Hey, cupbearer, what'd you think of that?"
Right. So this,
afterwards. So
this would be
very influential.
Right. This was a very influential person. This was not just, an average worker in Pharaoh's house. Now, the baker, I don't have any great insight about what that was, but clearly you must have been pretty good, right, to serve at Pharaoh's table. Yeah. But what happens is...
Celebrity chef.
Right,
yeah.
There we go. Yeah. It's the Bobby Flay of Egypt in the, I forget what year this would be.
I don't know.
3000-ish BC, something like that. All that to say that this is what's the situation. These two people are put into prison, and they each have a dream on the same day. And that each of the dreams have a component where in 3 days something will happen to you. And as far as the chief cupbearer's dream, it was that he would be raised up. And in the chief baker's dream, it was that he was to be raised up, but there were these birds eating from the baskets as if he had made some cakes or something like that. And so Joseph interprets the dreams as, hey, chief cupbearer, you're going to be restored to your position. Hey, but when you do, I have one thing to ask, and then that's you remember me. And the chief baker, he gives him the bad news. Yeah, it's not going to go good for you in 3 days. Pharaoh's going to raise up your head, but it's going to be because it's off your shoulders. And so that's the interpretation of the dreams. And yet, after that, what we see is, and actually let's just read this, Genesis 40, 20 through 23.
Yeah. On the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to him. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him.
My bad. I said he got decapitated.
Yeah.
No, he got hung. Sorry. I will correct myself. But Genesis 41, 1 through 13, and this is right after verse 23. What did it say, Stephen, 23? It says, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but he forgot him. So think about that. Joseph has done everything right. Here's this opportunity to see some salvation from the hardship that he has, and yet he's forgotten. And then Genesis 41, 1 through 13, the first verse says, after 2 whole years. Think about that. We read that sentence and we just quickly go because we're going along with the story. But in Joseph's shoes, we know that he's been in prison at least 2 years. And that was for, all we had on the time before that was, after some time. So he's been in prison for 2 whole years at the minimum before God chooses to deliver him from this plight that he's in. And so let's read this together. It says, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Steve, if you'll start in verse 9 for us.
Okay. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And he interpreted to us, so it came about, I was restored to my office and the baker was hanged. Keep going.
No, we'll start right
Yeah.
there. So I just want to point out again, just a reminder, I just can't emphasize enough. It was 2 whole years before Joseph was brought before Pharaoh. 2 years. I know, seriously. Like, it was 2 years, and that it was clearly known that this guy, we could see, not only did Joseph's actions show favor amongst Potiphar's house, amongst captain of the guard's house, but it was so much so amongst the chief cupbearer that he goes, I remember my offenses. I remember that the Lord was upon this person, and that he could interpret dreams. And so we're going to see this in verse 41, 25 through 32. It says, Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. He's been brought to interpret the dreams. I need to preface that with that. It says, Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dreams mean that this thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Verse 25. We're going to be to... Excuse me, I wrote that twice. Sorry.
Yeah.
So what I want you to see is Joseph interprets the dreams, right? He tells it that he doubled the dream, so you know it was going to come true. I've made it very clear that I'm going to bring about 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And so, Steve, verse 32 should keep going for us there. Should be what Pharaoh does too.
Okay, now therefore, so then he says, Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh for foods in his cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land and against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you.
So we see that finally, after many, many years of hardship, after many years of faithfulness, of, I would say, what seems like unfair circumstances and unfair things to happen to him, from being sold into slavery, from being wrongly accused, to being thrown into prison, to being forgotten in prison, before Joseph's faithfulness to God receives, I say, a blessing. He finally gets to this point where what happens, it's not just any blessing, right? This is probably the biggest blessing that he could have received. Wouldn't you say so? Yeah. There's probably, Pharaoh has said to them, go ahead.
And I was going to say, he's been blessed everywhere he's gone. It's just been the blessing has been pulled out from underneath him very, very quickly.
Right.
And kind of wonder if he's not just waiting for it to be pulled out now a little bit too.
Yeah. So I guess I can't help but for us to notice that he says only, and remember, Egypt is probably the biggest and most powerful known, I'll say, country in the entire known world in this time. And he said, only besides being Pharaoh are you second. Only besides being the most powerful person in all the known world, you are second to. That's the only thing you're second to. And so Joseph is going to be blessed. He's going to have the opportunity to lead Egypt and through the people and the land to basically save all the known world. That he is able to bring in those storehouses of 7 years. He's able to then portion it out, and he makes Egypt even richer than it was before, because he sells the grain to everybody that comes. And it's through all this that we see a great reconciliation of God brings this famine, brings Joseph's families back to him, And what happens during this time is his brothers come. There's a lot of back and forth because he wants to really see whether all of his family is still alive. He wants to see if his father's still alive. And it becomes this point where the whole family bows down to Joseph just as God had promised in the beginning. And the reason I say it like this is because it really shows us because Joseph waited on the Lord and was just remained faithful each step of the way instead of trying to force his desires onto God and expedite God's plan and put it in his timing. Instead, he waits on the Lord, and the Lord elevates him each time. And it's weird to say that, right? Because it seemed like his circumstances got worse each time, but he got him one step closer to the ultimate plan and blessing that he had for him, that he blessed him along the way. Clearly, Joseph saw that enough of that he knew that he was doing the right thing. He didn't say, I'm done with God. I'm done with doing it your way. And instead, we see him that he's faithful and that God continues to get him closer until he ultimately gets him to the blessing that he has for him. And so we kind of see the culmination of all that in Genesis 47, 27 through 28. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. I think it's kind of interesting, not interesting, it's just evident that the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph was, I'll give you a promised land, I'll make you a great people, but I will do all this so that you will bless the nations. And every time we see, and he says, if you will trust and obey me, if you will follow my words, if you will be, my people. And so whenever Abraham, Isaac, Jacob were trusting God, obeying God, the blessing always went out beyond their borders, always went out beyond who they were. You see this no greater person than Joseph. Joseph trusted, obeyed God, was faithful, kept doing it, and God gave him that covenant promise that you'll be a blessing to the nations. Joseph saved the nations of that time period. And so kind of a reminder to us that as we are trust and obey God, and when we're in that place where we're seeking God, and when we're in that place where we're following God, that is when the blessing goes outside of our little area to the people that are around us and outside of that. So sorry.
No, you're great. That's great. I wanted you to add that. Anytime you want to jump in, Steve. I know I've kind of talked a lot. We're going to have a discussion, guys. Don't worry, here in a second. But we're going to get to this end, and we see in Genesis 47, 27 through 28, it says, Thus Israel, remember Israel is Jacob, settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 70 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147. And the reason I point that in there is kind of this whole culmination of God said, I'm going to make you a great people, the fulfilling of the covenant. Yes, it takes them out of the promised land, yet that's why we're going to have the deliverers starting again in 2 weeks to see how God gets his people back to the land of Canaan. But this time in Egypt was an important time for God to fulfill his purpose and the big story along the way, because they get there, and which is like me, besides, sitting under and listening to people teach, I don't know the geography, I'll say like the land of Egypt, like the back of my hand, but just know this, that Goshen was the most fertile and best land. So God provided for his people to go and to be in a place where they would thrive in their possessions and thrive in their multiplication, and they would become a people so unwieldy. That's how they end up in slavery. I won't steal much of Steve's going to talk about Moses when we come back, but remember the people of Egypt get so fearful of just how powerful they become that they enslave the entire people group. But that's what God used. He used Joseph to get his people there to continue to carry out his covenant. And we see Joseph is more blessed. Is that the right way to say that? Yeah. He's more blessed along the way because he does it God's way and he does it in God's timing. So that's what I want to for us to talk about, Steve, going forward, is to kind of discuss some application pieces for us, is so that when we're faced with being faithful in life, what are the keys, or what are some keys for us to remain faithful, even when it seems like doing the right thing, when doing the right thing puts us in maybe a worse spot, or it's the hardest possible decision, or we see that puts us in a place where, how in the world does God get us out of that one?
Yeah. Well, first of all, God doesn't promise us comfort for our obedience. He just asks us to be obedient. He doesn't say, if you're obedient, I'll make you comfortable all the time. He just says, I want you to be obedient. I think it's interesting that they kept talking about and I understand where you were talking about Joseph's behavior and how Joseph behaved, but at each of those spots it says that God favored Jacob. God favored Jacob and had his steadfast love, which we talked about Sunday morning, means mercy or just enduring love and care for him. So us recognizing that God is with us and that God loves us and that God is taking care of us makes no matter what we go through a whole lot easier than it would be if we didn't know that. And you have to think that Joseph recognized that, and that was part of the reason why he was the way he was. But we don't know because it's not put in there in commentary. So
I think that's some of the things that we can infer. When I'm thinking about how do we remain faithful when we're faced with that difficult decision, when trusting God and doing the right thing, I'll say, puts us in a hard spot. And I think the reason I wanted to point out at the very beginning is that God had a plan that transcended all of sin, all of brokenness, all of man trying to force their plan on us. It was that we can know that if we do it God's way, that God clearly has the ability, the desire, and the purpose to bring us to the outcome that he has. And I think that that's just an important thing, because sometimes I know that we're put in an opportunity that the right decision is the hardest thing to do. And Steve and I were talking about this week to each other as we were just chatting, that probably there's never been a point in time, at least in our lifetimes, that the choice to do the right thing might have more consequences than before. And so I think this is an opportune thing for us to hear, and I'm not trying to be a doom and gloom person, because this happens in normal life, but I think on a macro level as the church, that there's never going to be a more time that we need to be encouraging each other that, hey, no matter what is happening in the world around us, that no matter what is happening in your personal life and no matter what's happening in our life, as in the whole church, and I mean that, kind of the church universal, not just, our church that meets here at Thomasville Road, that doing the right thing, that trusting that God really does have a plan that transcends everything that's going on right now, that if we follow him, it may lead us, like in Joseph's life, to a harder spot. But knowing that if we do it in God's way and we remain faithful, that he has a purpose, that he has a plan, and he has the ability to, I'll say, bring us to the other side in a better place, to be blessed by that faithfulness in his inside of his righteousness. And I think that that's just an important thing for us to remember. I think it's something to give us comfort. I think that's one of the things that I talk about this when I was teaching students, that because it was said to me when I was a student that knowing how you'll react when you're put in the situation, like pre-planning how you're going to react, is what makes it makes it easier in that moment to do the right thing. And I think that's the kind of thing for us that I guess I'm trying to really, focus
and knowing
in on
what
here.
the right thing is, which is knowing God's word. Yeah.
So it's like, I know I'm going to face with hard things in my life. So knowing what God's word says about each of those situations, knowing what the right answer is, and then saying, when I'm faced with that, I know it's going to work out for the best if I do the right thing. So it's not a choice when you get there, it's a reaction. And I think that that's just something that's always been helpful to me in my life, as a kind of as a practical tidbit of how do we remain faithful when we're faced with those hard decisions is make it not a choice then, make it a choice now when we're not having to face it and face how hard the consequences might be. All right. So something else I want us to kind of discuss is, that's kind of the hardship, but what about when Joseph got to when he got to the point where things were good, right? So let's talk about some of the things of how do we remain faithful in that time. And then also, I think he kind of had a really good opportunity to, I'll say, right the wrongs with his family, to punish them for the sins. And yet we see this beautiful picture of redemption and forgiveness. So why don't you jump in and talk about that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, Joseph's reactions or Joseph's actions in success say almost more about him than they do when he was not a success. A lot of times you have no other option other than to trust God for what you're in. It's bad. It can't get worse. So I'm going to trust God to get me out of this. But now Joseph is second of all people to Pharaoh. And like I said, I do think Joseph was probably sitting around going, okay, what's going to happen next? Because this is, it's probably going to happen because he'd seen this happen over and over again. And the next thing he knows, his brothers roll up. And so, and Joseph very easily could have been vindictive. He could have easily just said, kill them all. He was second to Pharaoh. Who was going to question that? Pharaoh would be like, why are you killing them? They're my brothers and they threw me in a pit. Okay, I got you. So, they would have been fine with that. So him showing compassion, him seeking God and shows his relationship with God more than it does than what he did when he was down. He could have easily, God's blessed me, I'm in a good place, I don't need to continue to act in a way that's proper all the time, and done what he wanted to, and thought his rights or what he deserved would be appropriate at that time, and God would be okay with it. But he didn't see it that way. And so it really shows a lot of how much Joseph had grown.
I would say, like, what I hear you saying.
Joseph doesn't talk much.
Right.
In the whole story of Joseph doesn't say much. It's really a lot of talking about Joseph.
There's a lot of narrative, as a narrator about him. But what I hear you saying, what I want to point out to us is that, don't go blank on me, Josh. Come on. Sorry. So what I hear Joseph saying, what I hear you saying is about Joseph is that what we do in the bad, but also what we do in the good really speaks and gives credit to whether we really are faithful and whether we really truly believe what God is. Because so it's easy to trust God. Sometimes I think easier when it's in the bad. And this is what I can hear you saying is because we know that he's going to persevere. You know it's the right thing to do. But when God is blessing us, and I would say I think sometimes we feel a little more freedom in that. But what we do during that time, the fact that we choose to remain faithful to God and not say, I've made it, I have accomplished it, I'm going to remain faithful to God.
We can puff ourselves up and think we're responsible for our successes.
See, I got here because of my ability to interpret dreams. Joseph could have easily been and had that mindset. But instead, he chooses to say, even in the success, I'm going to choose to follow God. And I think that speaks to the ability of when we are able to live in humility, to live and realize that we are in a spot because God brought us there, not because we've earned it, is kind of that twofold thing. When people see us when things are hard, pointing to God, and then when people see us when it's positive, pointing to God, there's no question about where we find our trust, our identity, our hope, and about who we are saying. The words that we say about him are true because it really gives credit to God being a God that we are serving no matter what, across circumstances. It's about a decision that we make to seek him. Do you have any more you want to add tonight? All right.
Oh, for the whole thing?
Yeah, for the whole thing.
No, I'm good.
All right. Well, we've done a few minutes early, but again, if I could just point out to us, take a moment over the next week and kind of do some homework, flip back through the book of Genesis and just take in that we serve an incredibly faithful God that is able to restore and redeem brokenness, who has a plan for us, that we can't wreck that plan. Praise the Lord that we can't do that, and that he will give mercy and grace to us when we need it, and that he is someone that when we choose to be faithful and wait on him, that he wants us to be a tool used by him to accomplish and be a part of the grand things that he wants to do. And I think that that's just an incredible thing for us to reflect on.
And Genesis is a book that starts off really good and ends really good and has a bunch of junk that goes all wrong in the middle. And that's one of the glorious things is that God creates everything in man for a purpose, and then you actually see a portion of that purpose being revealed and restored at the end of Genesis. Sad thing is you turn to the first page of Exodus and all of a sudden Pharaoh's killing babies. And so it's just an example that you see over and over again of God getting his people where he wanted them to be, but I guarantee you they had no idea it was going to take them the direction that it went. And we're going to look at the wilderness campaign. We're going to look at, not wilderness campaign, what am I talking about? Civil War. But when we talk about the Israelites in the wilderness, when we talk about Moses, because I'm going to highlight that part more than anything because I think we can learn the most from that. But you see the same thing. Like they knew their point A and point B, but they hit every point from A to B or A to Z in there and came back around and zoomed. So God doesn't always do things the way we imagine he's going to do them. Sometimes he takes a very circuitous route to get there. Sometimes he has a lot of lessons to teach us. We see that with Joseph. And so you're going to see that continue as we get into the deliverers. We're just going to call them I don't know, what are we, heroes. Let's call them heroes. We'll call them heroes for now. So anyhow, that's, just the idea of the fact that when we're looking at our lives and we say, hey, we know that this is what God wants for me. God's called me to be. It might not be what you get tomorrow. It might be a ways for you to get to that point, and you have to learn some things. God's got to knock off some rough edges, all that kind of stuff. And it's okay, and it's good to see these people in the Bible that had to do the same thing. And in that, you go to Hebrews, and they're all commended for their faith and how wonderful they were. But we get to see all the nitty-gritty, dirty parts in Genesis, Exodus, and all that kind of stuff. So,
all right. Well, just remember, we won't be here next week. I'm going to encourage you to take some Sabbath time.
Yep.
Don't let the way that we live life crowd some busyness into that hole. Since we have given you a hole next week in your weekly schedule, use it for some Sabbath time. Take some time to pray for yourself, to pray for our church, and just ask God to just kind of renew and restore you. And then we will see you next 2 weeks from now then.
On the 24th?
On the 24th.
31st, March 31st, we're going to Marty's going to do his Seder meal in here, which is, if you haven't seen him do it, Marty does a fantastic job at it. It's a lot of fun. And so he's going to do that in here.
So if you don't know what a Seder is, he will walk
Passover.
through the elements of the Passover feast and why.
And how they applied.
Yeah, and how that points into Easter and why
Yes.
Jesus used that time in the Lord's Supper to point to the remembrance of his crucifixion, dying on the sins, and giving new life.
And Marty wears a crazy outfit. He's got a little hat on. It's pretty funny. You should take pictures and make fun of him. Okay, Josh.
So come back, join us 2 weeks from now. Enjoy some rest next week as we kick off the Delivers, and then be here as we celebrate Easter in a couple weeks. Why don't you pray for us, and we'll go.
Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day. We thank you for this night that we have to come together as the body of Christ, and just to hear your word, and to look at the lives of these people that we've been looking at since all the way from Adam and Eve, all the way to Joseph, and just how your hand has been upon them, how your grace has been given to them, how your blessing has been shown to them. And Lord, how you just have been a part of every part of their lives, even when they don't see it, and that you're the same in ours, Lord. And Lord, help us to take courage in that, help us to take faith in that, and to trust you in all that we do. May we bring glory to you in all that we do. It's in your holy precious name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Have a great week, and go with God.
Go with God. What is it? Yes, sir.
I had to resign my job for the city council because of traffic. You know, that's what,
Yeah.
anyway, this was getting to me. And